we are in a very serious position. So supporting Ukraine is not just a nice thing to do with our spare cash, it's actually fundamental to the security of this country. And our politicians need to be speak louder about it. The media needs to speak louder about it. We need to get this real and actually focus on it. This is a late 1930s moment. And if we don't react to it, we're doomed not to learn the lessons of history.
What do you think when you hear Lord Cameron? How fertile is the ground upon which his words fall? 2 years ago, they might have been very fertile, but as he said himself, there's a sense of fatigue, a sense that maybe a compromise might be attractive. And let's remember, he was there at the UN General Assembly, and Russia has friends there.
Yes, you asked the question, how fertile is the ground on which his words might fall? I think it's us to actually make sure that there's plenty of fertilizer on that ground, because what David Cameron is saying is absolutely spot on. If Vladimir Putin concedes or conceives that he has won in any shape or form in Ukraine, it is extraordinarily dangerous for the security of the rest of the West, and particularly of Europe. David Cameron particularly referenced Moldova and the Baltic states, and of course he's absolutely right. Moldova, a little independent state, already has Russian soldiers stationed in it. They have no security forces of their own, but the Baltic states are NATO members, and should there be an attack on any of those, that would be an attack on all the rest of us under Article 5 of the North Atlantic Treaty. So David Cameron's words are very wise. They're the words that many of us have been saying for quite some time, that we absolutely need to go on supporting Ukraine to make sure that in no shape or form does Russia win in Ukraine, and that Ukraine is fighting a battle for the security of Europe, and we should absolutely stand four square behind them.
You may not have seen the front page of tomorrow's Independent. It's a picture of some soldiers and a very heavy gun firing artillery shells, and the headline, "If Ukraine loses, the West is next." And then they give us a number of figures: at least 10,582 Ukrainian civilians dead, 19,875 injured, an estimated 70,000 Ukrainian soldiers killed in 2 years of fighting. And one wonders just how many Russian soldiers have been killed in President Putin's meat grinder strategy. It's been a very expensive adventure for him. And given the cost, do you really think that if he did manage to keep some part of Ukraine, he'd be tempted to go into a NATO country, given the apocalyptic cost that would visit upon his country and his people?
Well, you ask a very good question. I haven't seen tomorrow's Independent. I'm not sure whether you've seen tomorrow's Express, but
I have,
there is an
yes.
article in tomorrow's Express in which I and my co-author of a book we published in the autumn makes it very clear that the cost of fighting a war is disastrous, but there is a price on deterrence. And the big question is whether NATO members, and particularly NATO members in Europe, are willing to pay the price for deterrence. Now, NATO has a 2% line of GDP to be spent on defence by its members. Now, that's not a target, that's a minimum amount to be spent. But frankly, it's not enough to spend that amount on our defense to deter an aggressive country under the leadership of Vladimir Putin from our insecurity. So we've got to get really real. We've got to get grown up about this. While Vladimir Putin is leading a very aggressive Russia, we should be fearful for our own security in Europe, notwithstanding other threats more widely across the world.
Looking at the front page of the Telegraph, Britain to spend £250 million on artillery shells for Ukraine, and Ben Wallace, somebody who you'll know, the former Defence Secretary, calling on BAE Systems to step up operations at its Sunderland factory, producing 155mm shells. And then we've got Ukraine's Foreign Minister Dmytro Kuleba warning EU counterparts this week his armed forces would need 2.5 million artillery shells in 2024. To what extent would European and allied leaders be more keen and less fatigued if they felt Ukraine was making more progress than they have done thus far since the much vaunted counteroffensive last year?
Henry, don't criticise their counteroffensive.
I'm not criticising them, but I'm just
Henry,
talking about...
don't criticise their counteroffensive. criticize, if you will, the speed and enthusiasm by which NATO and Western countries were prepared to give them the equipment and the ammunition that they needed in the early part of last year, while we were dithering about whether we'd give them F-16s, Challenger 2s, Leopard 2s. The Russians weren't sitting on their backsides doing nothing. They were developing really comprehensive, deep and lengthy lines of defense. So when it came eventually to the point when the Ukrainians were prepared to launch their counteroffensive, they were launching themselves against really well-prepared defensive positions. It's not surprising they found it difficult to get through. So we've got to get realistic about this. Now, you mentioned supply of artillery ammunition. It is a fact today that Russian ammunition factories are working 24/7, 3 shifts around the clock. Question: how many ammunition factories do we have in this country, and what sort of shift regime are they on? We are not taking this seriously. Now, here's an historical fact, just very briefly. We had an aggressor in the 1930s, Hitler, and we chose to appease him until far too late did we begin to rearm. In this country, in 1935, we spent less than 3% of GDP on defense. In 1939, appeasement having failed, that shot up to 18%. In 1940, when we were fighting for our very survival, it was 46%. That's the disastrous cost of fighting a war. What price? Deterrence. Actually, currently, spending 2.3% of our GDP on defense is not giving us the deterrent contribution that we need. It should be 3, 4, or 5%, as it was in the Cold War. We're joking with ourselves if we think actually we're serious about facing down Vladimir Putin. This is a serious moment in our history, and whether we've got a general election coming up and social issues at home, health, education, all the rest of it are important. This is a really serious matter, and our politicians better blooming well wake up.
And when you criticize our politicians, are you talking about UK politicians or politicians across Western Europe and indeed NATO leaders? I'm wondering where we are in the league table of support for Ukraine when you look at our colleagues, counterparts, partners in the EU and NATO. Boris Johnson claimed we were leading.
Looking at the 2% figure, which NATO wants its members to spend, only 10 or 11 or maybe now 12 have reached that figure. Big countries like France and Germany are still below that figure. Now we are above it at about 2.3%, but then actually you include creative accounting, things like pensions, like my pension being added into that, which actually I'm afraid I add nothing to military capability today. But we've got to get serious about it. Our defence budget is around about £50 billion a year. We're priding ourselves in this country that we have given Ukraine just under 5 billion over the last 2 years. Well, we've given them 5 billion. We're spending 50 billion a year. We're spending 180, 190 on health and social security. Just where are the priorities and what is serious and what really matters? Frankly, our politicians are kidding themselves if they're looking after the wider interests of this country and the wider interests of the security of Europe.
Well, we know how unpopular support for Ukraine is among some Republican factions on Capitol Hill. What about here? How ready would people be to see an increase in taxes in order to boost the defense budget, particularly if it was to help fund the Ukrainian war effort? The generosity towards the refugees from Ukraine notwithstanding.
I mean, the big thing here is we're not just being generous in terms of overseas aid to Ukraine. What we actually absolutely have to understand, and our politicians and our media, and I say again, and our media, has to get the message across to our people that the security of Western Europe is being fought for by the people of Ukraine at the present moment. And if they fail, we then stand in a very, very perilous position with an aggressive Russia. If Russia was to push through Belarus to Lithuania to the Kaliningrad pocket, that's actually an attack on the rest of NATO. That's violated Article 5 of the North Atlantic Treaty. We are in a very serious position. So supporting Ukraine is not just a nice thing to do with our spare cash. It's actually fundamental to the security of this country. And our politicians need to speak louder about it. The media needs to speak louder about it. We need to get this real and actually focus on it. This is a late 1930s moment. And if we don't react to it, we're doomed not to learn the lessons of history.
And Lord Dannatt, can we pivot from what's happening in Ukraine to what's happening in Gaza and, of course, Israel? Because it's not just Ukraine that says it's on the front line defending Western values. Israel says the same thing about its battle with Hamas in Gaza. When you look at the Israeli defense strategy and the plan outlined today by the Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu for Israel to remain in Gaza as part of a long-term security settlement, what do you make of that?
Well, the situation in Gaza between Hamas and Israel is clearly very concerning. There is no getting away from the fact that the events of the 7th of October were an outrage as far as Israel is concerned. Hamas is sworn to destroy Israel. Israel has the absolute right, guaranteed by the international community, to exist. The big issue, and this is the difficult issue, is that within what we understand as the just war concept, there are two issues. Is it right to fight? And are they fighting right? Well, yes, of course, Israel is right to fight, but are they fighting right? Well, with 29,000 Gazan citizens killed in the last 4 months, that's an horrific number of people. So inevitably, popular opinion has swung and is swinging further against Israel. But I can put this back in the wider conversation that we were having. As concerning as the issues in the Middle East are, frankly, it's up to Iran to dial this up or dial this down. Iran supports Hamas, Hezbollah, the Houthis, but does Iran really want a war with America and a war with the West? No, it doesn't. So I'm less concerned about what's going on in the Middle East. I'm less concerned about threats by China to Taiwan. But what really keeps me awake, if I choose to stay awake at night, is what's going on between Russia and Ukraine, because that's in the interest of all of us here in Western Europe.
And how appalled are you by the prospect of a President Trump 2.0 from January 20th or whatever, 2025? The former Prime Minister Liz Truss would be cock-a-hoop, but how would you respond?
Well, I know Liz Truss is a fellow resident of Norfolk, but I'm afraid I don't share her views on that. I would hope very much that the American judicial system, with so many civil and criminal charges out against Donald Trump, will actually have debarred him from being a presidential candidate come November. I think the prospect of having him back in the White House is an appalling prospect, and one that I don't look forward to one little bit.